Welcome to the Unpacking the College and Career Readiness Standards presentation. The content of this presentation is adapted from the Standards in Action, Innovations for Standards-Based Education, 2009. After completing this activity, you'll be able to describe the steps in unpacking the College and Career Readiness Standards. You'll also learn the purpose of unpacking the standards and how they relate to teaching and learning. Standards are a tool that guide instruction. They describe the skills learners need and a sequence in how the skills are typically developed. In adult basic education in Pennsylvania, we use a set of standards called the College and Career Readiness Standards, or CCRS. The CCRS outline the academic skills adult learners need for post-secondary and careers. Using the CCRS provides a clear roadmap that can be used to plan instruction and show student progress. This can be helpful for any curriculum planning that may be done at a programmatic level, as well as lesson planning for your learners. In order to effectively use standards for lesson planning and teaching, it's important to first understand the intent of each standard. Additionally, instructors must identify the knowledge and skills needed for the standard to be taught and learned. Unpacking a standard is one way to better understand the intent of the standard and the knowledge and skills addressed in the standard. The unpacking method we will be demonstrating is based on the work of Grant Wiggins and Jay McTee, who pioneered understanding by design. By following this method, you'll be able to better understand the intent of the CCR standards, as well as identify what knowledge and skills are required in order to show mastery of each standard. This will help you with identifying which standards you want to include in your lesson plan, what instructional activities might look like, and how you will assess that students have shown mastery of the standard. There are many benefits of unpacking the standards. The unpacking process is a great way for instructors to gain a deeper understanding about the standards, especially if they are working as a team, and have conversations about the standards. That said, there is not always a right or wrong way to unpack a standard, and instructors might disagree about what should go in which column. In the end, the critical thinking and conversation about the standards is probably the most important outcome of unpacking as a team. The unpacking process allows instructors to maintain the focus on teaching the right content and skills, target curriculum and instruction to the right level of complexity, support shared professional learning and common expectations for students, and discuss the standards in a systematic, productive manner. On the screen is the chart for unpacking the components of the standards. You'll notice there are 6 columns that dictate the work of unpacking. The Unpacking the Components of a Standard chart helps instructors build a direct relationship between instructional objectives and classroom activities. This tool will help instructors focus more precisely on the concepts and skills they are teaching. This tool helps instructors to deliberately identify the level of cognitive demand required to meet the demands of the standards, and helps instructors to translate the standards into a set of activities that are meaningful to students as workers, citizens, family, and community members. Column 1 is where the standard is listed. This is where you would list the CCR standard, including the level. Column 2 asks us to indicate what skills are expected. Skills are what learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery of the concepts and content. They are represented by the verbs in the standard. Column 3 asks us to indicate what concepts or content are included in the standard. Concepts are the information or ideas that learners need to know. These are generally the nouns or noun phrases in the standard. If multiple skills are included in column 2, align the concepts with the skill to which they apply. This is unnecessary if the skills listed apply equally to all concepts. Column 4 asks us to indicate which contexts students are required to use the standard's skills and concepts. For example, writing an essay or solving a problem. Keep in mind that not every standard will have a stated context. Column 5 asks us to consider the cognitive demand or level of thinking. There are various taxonomies that can be used to determine the cognitive demand. We'll discuss them later in the module. To determine the cognitive demand, you'll want to consider all of the information in columns 2 through 4 to determine the level of thinking of the standard. Considering cognitive demand helps us to make choices about how to align instruction and assignment, unpack the content and skills in the standard, and design teaching activities to match those demands. Lastly, column 6 asks us to include a sample activity that encompasses the concepts and skills of the standard and is pitched at the right level of cognitive demand. On the following slide, we'll use these steps to unpack a standard together. You may want to use your copy of the Unpacking the Components of Standards chart to write notes as we go through the steps. Webb's Depth of Knowledge, or DOK, is a framework that can be used to describe the level of cognitive demand. It's a way to categorize the types of tasks that students are asked to complete based upon the thinking skills needed to perform the task. It has 4 levels. Level 1, Recall and Reproduction. Level 2, Skills and Concepts. Level 3, Strategic Thinking. Level 4, Extended Thinking. As the number of the level increases, the cognitive demand needed by the student to complete the task also increases. Take a moment to look at the verbs associated with each DOK level. For our examples, we chose to use Webb's DOK to determine the level of cognitive demand for this standard. For more information on cognitive demand, please visit the PA Adult Education Resources website at www.paadulteducationresources.org. Let's take a look at the College and Career Readiness Standards for Reading Anchor 3, Level B. Describe the relationship between a series of historical events, scientific ideas or concepts, or steps in technical procedures in a text, using language that pertains to time, sequence, and cause-effect. On your unpacking chart, you'd first want to list the standard in column 1. Next, you'll identify the skills in the standard. Take a moment to read the standard and identify the skills. If you're struggling to identify the skills, keep in mind that the skills are what learners are expected to do to demonstrate mastery of the concepts and content. The skills are represented by the verbs in the standard. Pause the video to identify the skills before progressing to the next slide. Once you have identified the skills, list them in column 2 in your unpacking chart. Did you identify these skills? This standard asks students to describe and use particular language. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Let's look at the standard again. The next step in unpacking is to identify the concepts in the standard. Take a moment to read the standard and identify the concepts. Once you have identified the concepts, list them in column 3 in your unpacking chart. If you're struggling to identify the concepts, keep in mind that the concepts are the information or ideas that learners need to know. Those generally are the nouns or noun phrases in the standard. Take a moment to pause the recording and write your answers in column 3. Did you identify these concepts? The concepts in this standard and level descriptor are relationship and time, sequence, cause and effect. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Let's look at the standard again. The next step in unpacking is to identify the context in the standard. Take a moment to read the standard and identify the context. Once you have identified the contexts, list them in column 4 in your unpacking chart. If you're struggling to identify the context, ask yourself in which context students are required to use the standard's skills and concepts. Take a moment to pause the recording and write your answers in column 4. In this reading standard, we identified 3 contexts. 1. Students are required to describe the relationship between a series of historical events. Historical events are the context in which the students need to use the skill of describing a relationship. 2. Students are required to describe the relationship between a series of scientific ideas. 3. Students are also asked to describe the steps in technical procedures in a text. The skill of describing, in this case, is in the context of a text. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Now it's time to identify the level of thinking, the cognitive demand, for each standard. Taking into account the level of thinking needed to meet the standard enables staff to make choices about how best to align both instruction and assessment. In this case, we'll use Webb's depth of knowledge to identify the cognitive demand for this standard. Take a moment to review Webb's DOK as you scan the standard. According to Webb's depth of knowledge, describing a relationship falls under Level 2. A Level 2 describe or explain task requires students to go beyond a basic description or definition to predict a possible result or explain why something might happen, according to Karen Hess. Level 2 goes beyond recall and reproduction and requires learners to apply their skills and understanding of concepts to answer questions or complete tasks. This often includes the application of multiple concepts at once. Objectives for activities at this level might ask learners to make inferences, summarize information, make estimates or predictions, compare and contrast information, identify strategies to use when solving problems, or identify relationships between concepts such as cause and effect. Take a moment to read through the ideas for activities and classroom products listed in the chart for language arts and math. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. As you review your chart, consider the activities or tasks your students might benefit from to meet the demands of the standard. On the next slide, we'll look at some questions to consider as we develop a sample activity. When you're developing your activities, you might ask yourself the following questions. Have you targeted this standard in your classroom activities before? If so, what were those activities? How did your students respond? How could the students use the skills identified within this standard outside of the classroom? Can we enhance the activity to increase the rigor and challenge students? Are there additional concepts and skills within other standards that students need to complete this activity? How can this activity be described in just a few sentences? These questions will help you create measurable and attainable objectives, which we will talk about in the following slide. When developing your sample activity, it might be helpful to draft a SMART objective. A SMART objective is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Let's write a learning objective to support the skills the students need to learn and use competently. It is important that the lesson learning objective not only identifies the specific skill, but also includes a way to assess learning. Using your unpacking chart, identify the specific relevant skills and a way to assess competent use of those skills. When developing a sample activity, it is important to ensure the activity's alignment to the standard and objective. Here, our sample objective is: students will be able to describe how a series of events led to the Civil War using language pertaining to time, sequence, and cause and effect. Take a moment to make some observations around the standard and the objective. Notice the objective identifies the skill, content, context directly from the standard. Our sample activity is: students will review vocabulary pertaining to time, sequence, and cause and effect. Students will then watch video clips about several events that occurred between 1861 and 1865. Students will describe the sequence of events and their effects on a digital timeline graphic organizer in small groups. Take a moment to make observations about the activity. The activity reflects the verbs or skills within the standard, as students are asked to describe the sequence of events as they led to the Civil War using a graphic organizer. The concepts and content within the standard are also included in the activity, as students are asked to sequence and use cause and effect. You may have also noticed that we are targeting Level 2 in the DOK chart. The unpacking process allows instructors to maintain the focus on teaching the right content and skills. Now your unpacking chart is complete. Next, we'll unpack a mathematics standard together. Now we'll unpack a math standard. Again, you may want to use a copy of the Unpacking the Components of Standards chart to jot down notes as we go through the steps. Let's take a look at the College and Career Readiness Standard for Reason with Shapes and Their Attributes. Understand that shapes in different categories, like rhombuses, rectangles, and others, may share attributes, like having 4 sides, and that the shared attributes can define a larger category, like quadrilaterals. Recognize rhombuses, rectangles, and squares as examples of quadrilaterals, and draw examples of quadrilaterals that do not belong to any of these subcategories. The first step in unpacking is to identify the skills in the standard. Take a moment to read the standard and identify the skills. Don't forget that the verbs are usually the skills. Once you've identified the skills, list them on your unpacking chart in column 2. Did you identify these skills? This standard asks students to reason with shapes, understand that shapes are categorized by shared attributes, recognize the examples of quadrilaterals, and finally, draw examples of quadrilaterals. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Let's look at the standard again. The second step in unpacking is to identify the concepts in the standard. Take a moment to read the standard and identify the concepts. Once you have identified the concepts, list them in column 3 in your unpacking chart. If you're struggling to identify the concepts, keep in mind that the concepts are the information or ideas that learners need to know. Those are generally the nouns or noun phrases in the standard. Take a moment to pause the recording and write your answers in column 3. The concepts in this standard are shapes, attributes, categories, rhombus, rectangle, and quadrilateral. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Let's revisit the standard once again to identify a context in which students are required to apply the skills and concepts of the standard. The context is the circumstances in which the skills and content of a particular standard should be used. For example, writing a memo, solving a problem, or reading a document. Not every standard will have a stated context. In those cases, simply leave that column blank or assign a context to teach the standard. Take a moment to read through the standard and list the context in column 4. A context is not specified in this standard. However, we can use a number of contexts to teach the standard. It is also important to consider our students when determining a context for teaching a standard. What context might support your learners? Construction, manufacturing, decorating, hanging pictures, floor plans. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Now it's time to identify the level of thinking, the cognitive demand for each standard. Taking into account the level of thinking needed to meet the standard enables staff to make choices about how best to align both instruction and assessment. Move to the next slide to view the DOK chart for assistance. Can you identify where this standard might fit in the DOK chart? Which words in the standard might support you in identifying the depth of knowledge or cognitive demand for the standard? You may want to pause the recording to allow you time to review the chart and determine the DOK level. According to Webb's depth of knowledge, understand is a level 1 activity. This includes activities and assessments in which learners are asked to recall and reproduce information or skills. This could include tasks in which the objective is for learners to identify or state facts or information, calculate problems, and measure or label things. At this level, learners use skills in recognition, memorization, description, definition, and application of routine processes and procedures. There are a variety of potential activities and classroom products at this level. Take a moment to read through the ideas listed in the chart for language arts and math. Your unpacking chart might look like this right now. Here again are the questions to consider when developing an activity or task. Can you think of any additional questions you might ask yourself while developing an activity? Keep these questions in mind as we progress through the next few slides. When developing a sample activity, it is important to ensure the activity's alignment to the standard and objective. Here, our sample objective is: students will be able to draw and categorize shapes based on shared attributes. Students will use shape and category names in describing a drawing. Take a moment to make some observations around the standard and the objective. Notice the objective identifies the skill, content, context directly from the standard. Our sample activity is: Create a diagram of their dream kitchen using shapes to represent appliances, walls, furniture, an island, etc. Describe their diagrams using geometric terminology. Recognize the shapes in a partner's drawing. Organize and categorize shapes found in a partner's drawing. Take a moment to make observations around the activity. The activity reflects the verbs or skills within the standard, as students are asked to create a diagram with different shapes, describe their diagram, and recognize shapes in other students' diagrams. The nouns, or content knowledge, are also included, as the students are using shapes to represent appliances, walls, and furniture. The context has not been dictated by the standard, and so we developed one for the standard. The sample activity asks students to consider their dream kitchen when using and describing shapes. You may have also noticed that we are targeting Level 2 in the DOK chart. The unpacking process allows instructors to maintain the focus on teaching the right content and skills. Your unpacking chart is complete for this mathematics standard. Now let's look at some example standards. Here is another sample chart for unpacking the components of standards. There are 3 different standards represented here. What do you notice about these examples? Consider the alignment of the sample activity to the standard. What do you notice about the connections? Please pause the video and review the 3 different standards on the screen. For the first standard, you may have noticed that the sample activity does not use the verb or skill describe. However, the activity does ensure that students have an opportunity to demonstrate that skill by having them analyze the text features and content. The second unpacked standard has an activity that asks students to apply their knowledge of words with multiple meanings to create a riddle. This sample activity allows the student to demonstrate the skills required by the standard. The third example describes an activity that asks students to apply their interpretation skills to rewrite the recipe. In each example, the teacher makes choices about how to align both instruction and assessment, unpack the content and skills demands in the standards, and design teaching activities to match those demands. Thank you for unpacking a reading and mathematics standard together. In conclusion, we'd like to remind you how unpacking helps instructors with their work to teach adult learners the skills needed for post-secondary education and career success. Unpacking helps instructors address how to maintain the focus on teaching the right content and skills, target curriculum and instruction to the right level of complexity, and support shared professional learning and common expectations for students. By engaging in the unpacking process, instructors increase their understanding and ownership of the standards to better align instruction to the demands of the standards. This module was to provide practitioners with a process and purpose for unpacking the CCR standards. Now that you have been introduced to the Unpacking CCR Standards process, consider what support you need to implement this process. For additional support, please reach out to your agency in-house professional development specialist or to your agency's professional learning opportunities consultant.